Okay, well, let me start off first. I want to ask you, Juan, what drew you to this project? What were the theoretical, historical, and political issues you hope to address with this study of the achievements and limitations of the so-called pink tide governments in the excuse me, in the arena of welfare reform in Latin America?
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. What drew me to this project was mostly the scarcity of critical engagement with the topic. Um, what I noticed when I was studying these issues of social welfare and social reforms in Latin America, I what I couldn't find was critical assessments that would point to the strict limits that these policies were having. And what I mean by this is, in the period of 2000, after 2000, early to 2010s, there were this wave of center-left governments in Latin America that passed progressive policies, right? Like pension reforms, health reforms, conditional cash transfers that gave a modicum sum to unemployed and poor people. And so all these policies were celebrated by most academics, scholars, and analysts. And there's a reason for that, because after so many years of neoliberalism, that change, which caused a reduction in income inequalities, for example, that had been rising for a long time, that change was welcome, of course. But the way that scholars and academics, most of them at least, engaged with these reforms was extremely positive. It was this is a step towards universalism. This is extremely, there was no critical assessment, and I was seeing many of the issues of increased inequities within those social policies that we can talk a bit more later. And so on the one hand, there was all this strand of people celebrating these policies as the best that we could aspire to. And on the other hand, from the Marxist perspective, there was not much of an engagement with the social policies themselves. There was a strong critique of the political economy in general, of these center-left governments. But the area of social policy was not really seriously engaged with and criticized. And I thought at that time, and I still think, that there is a way to understand social rights and social policies as a key reform that can strengthen worker struggles and can strengthen the fight for a different kind of system and empower working class actors, working class organizations. And I felt like that was lacking from both perspectives.
Okay, why don't you take a few minutes and just give us the broad outlines of your argument and your findings, particularly. And then there's a couple of points I want to get into in a little bit more detail before we throw it open to everybody else.
Yeah. The book offers a mixed methods study. The first few chapters are a quantitative assessment of a wide range of data that I collected from different sources on 17 countries, all Latin American countries except the Caribbean countries, and between the period 2002 and 2017. And what I assessed particularly in those years is the level, the degree of decommodification that welfare policies, welfare regimes offer in each of those countries, and how that changes over time in that period, which is something that had not been done before. I think I should say a little more about what decommodification means, because it's a long word, and I take it from S.P. Anderson, one of the most cited scholars in welfare. What he defines as the main goal of welfare policy under capitalism is to partially decommodify labor. What this means is to offer services and rights that make labor less of a commodity, that pushes working class people a little less to sell their labor power every day in order to survive. So if you have access to healthcare, access to education, access to an income replacement, then You're gonna, if you're sick, for example, you can choose to not go to work, right? You can, if you're old and you don't want to work anymore, you can retire. We see the obverse of that, the lack of that here in the U.S., right? This is how, people work until they die here because you don't have those rights. And so the question is how you operationalize that, how you measure the commodification. And there had been several attempts among Latin American scholars, and I wasn't happy with those, so I created my own method with a lot of help from Janet Gornick, who's here. Thank you very much for all the technical aspects of how to measure that. And one of the things I identified was 3 dimensions of that welfare. And one is inclusion, which means the percentage of people who are including those policies. The other one is generosity, or the quality of those policies, and the third one is inequity or equity. And one of the main findings was that even though there was improvement, as most of the literature was saying, the dimension of equity not only did not improve, but it got worse. It deteriorated across the board. And so that's one of the main findings, and that's why I call it universalism deferred, because universalism didn't come. I conceptualize universalism as the maximum degree of all those 3 dimensions, right? But if you don't have equity, then that is missing. And then the second half of the book is a comparative historical analysis of 3 cases, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, on 2 policy areas, pensions and healthcare. And in that, I provided more fine-grained analysis, because one of the, 2 puzzles that were still, that needed explanation were, on the one hand, there were some specific cases where progressive structural reforms did address these inequities. And I wanted to try to explain that. And then the other one was why privatization or marketization of education, healthcare, pensions continued unabated in most of the cases. And this is where my framework, the Marxist conceptual framework that I provide, I think this is where it stands out, or it's more different than most of the literature, because I find it most robust to explain these 2 things. And this is conceptualizing elected officials, the state managers, as actors who are constantly under pressure from 2 classes, right? From mostly 2 classes, the capitalist class and the working class. And they are structurally under pressure to provide conditions for profits, for business, for the economy to grow. So this is a structuralist Marxist interpretation of the state. And so when they pass policies that favor businesses, that reduce taxes, that improve or lower labor costs, etc., that's where they expect economic growth, and that's where most of their popularity depends on. So they're structurally bound to that. Now, there are moments in which, because there's class struggle, because there's disruption, there's roadblocks, there's a lot of discontent, widespread unrest. Well, in those moments is where these elected officials are more prone, are more likely to pass structural welfare reforms. And that's exactly what I saw in the cases. In the case of Argentina, with the nationalization of pensions in 2008, and in the case of the structural reform in Uruguay. There was widespread discontent. One of the main determinants of social policy that I propose, which also is missing in most of the literature, is the balance of classes between the balance of power between classes. And so you have a very strong, very organized working class, and on the other hand, a divided capitalist class with 2 different programs. And so that's when structural welfare reforms happen. But at the same time, this happens against the background of a constant privatization, because the more private medicine grows, and that fosters economic growth, and that's elected officials are structurally propense to foster those businesses and those economic investments, because they want investment, right? And so you see across the board what I call privatization by default, which is not outright privatizations like, oh, we're going to privatize, for example, the MTA, the transport system here. That's not what happens. But in education, for example, they leave the door open so that by defunding public schools, it encourages private schools to mushroom, to grow, and so that generates clearly inequalities between families that can afford private education and those that cannot afford it, that have to go to public school, that have less resources, and so on and so forth.
Okay, just a couple of quick comments is that one of the things that came very clear in the book was that it was not simple that in measuring and assessing the balance of class forces, in particular under what conditions state managers actually make substantive concessions to working people. That this is much more than simply electing left politicians, routine protests, etc., but what you called a crisis of legitimacy. And I think it's also interesting that this question of equity, which we'll get to, I want you to get into in more detail in a minute, also is evident in the in the global north, in the so-called core countries of the capitalist world. I mean, you can see in Britain, for example, the gutting of the National Health Service, which had always been presented to the world as the epitome of social democratic universalism, and had been for a good 20 or 30, 40 years after 1945. You see there, particularly starting under the first New Labour government in the 90s, a process by which cuts to the NHS creates spaces for private health care to fill those gaps for those who can afford it. And that you end up, it's the weakest sections of the working class, those who can't get supplemental health insurance from their employers, who end up reliant solely on NHS. But I think the next question there's three things I want you to sort of focus in on and talk about really in somewhat more detail, because I think they're quite important and original in this book. The first is the way you expand the definition of universalism, that you not only look at the quantitative expanded funding, expanded coverage, but you focus in on this question of relative inequality and segmentation. And I wanted you to sort of take some time and talk more about why this is really, really crucial to understanding welfare reform, not just in Latin America, but I think globally over the last half century, since the advent of neoliberalism. And why are these questions of inequality and segmentation, of the architecture, what you call the architecture of these social welfare programs, so crucial to any meaningful measurement of universalism?
Yeah, there's a debate in the literature about what universalism means, and there's different interpretation. I think we should understand universalism as equitable, generous welfare policy for everyone. In other words, those services or transfers or income replacement, pensions, should be given as a social right. And when you put in those terms, it dramatically changes how the impact that it has on working class people, which are the beneficiaries of welfare policies, right? Because if you, for example, if there is access to, in Argentina, I'm from Argentina, there's public hospitals. Everyone can walk into a public hospital. You're gonna get healthcare for free. I worked at a public hospital for 7 years, but what you see there is people who cannot afford private healthcare, or who don't have health insurance through their job, because they have to wait long lines, because oftentimes there's no resources there. And so that's a false kind of universalism. And that generates this dichotomy, this division within the working class. In Argentina, particularly, the health insurance that you get through your job is managed through the unions, which is a singularity of the country. But that in itself creates a division where formal workers have historically opposed any structural reform that would build a kind of NHS kind of system where it's universal and everyone gets the best quality that you can provide, because they want to keep that privilege, that benefit. Obviously, union leaders are top union officials in Argentina. Many of them are super corrupt, and they want to keep the benefit of managing those funds because that makes them, in a way, more powerful. And so, I think it's important that considering equity within universalism, not as part of universalism, not just because the reality of universalism without equity is poor services or second-class services, second-quality services for the poor and the informal workers, and better or high-quality services for the more well-off. Not only because of that, but also because in the long run, it divides the working class. Because, and going back to the question of decommodification, the ability that we as workers have to fight, the ability to engage in union organizing, in going on collective action, engaging in any kinds of collective action, that depends on what is at risk. If you're at risk of you losing your job, losing your healthcare, losing access to pensions, then you're gonna think about it twice, 3 times. If all of those things are already guaranteed as social rights, then that's a source of power. There's a tradition in the welfare literature that's called the power resource theories, and they not only consider power resources for the working class, the ways of organizing, union density, political parties that represent, labor parties, socialist parties that represent only working class people, but also the social rights that you can win, and that's a power resource in itself. So I think that's crucial, not for the present only, but also for the future.
So before we move on, could you just give us an example of, particularly the 3 case studies you looked at, where you saw greater funding for a program, greater formal inclusion of people, but greater structured inequality, more segmentation?
Well, education across the board, for example, there's greater funding, there's more social spending on education, there's more social spending on healthcare, but across the board, the enrollment in private education in this period, in this span of 15 to 20 years, goes, in some cases, goes from 2% to 10%, for example, of all primary school children enrolled. And so that clearly, and that has a reflection in real life as, yes, there is more funding for education overall, but teachers are not that happy. And teachers are not being paid what they think they should be paid, and the resources for schools are not great. So the buildings are falling apart in public schools, and teachers are going on strike more than in private school where they don't have rights. And so as a working class family who sends your kids to school, you start calculating, okay, if I send my kid to public school, I need to figure out what I'm gonna do in these 20, 30 days without classes because of strikes. And that is inevitably, not obviously, this is not to blame teachers for going on strike. They're going on strike for better public education, for larger spending and all that, but the inevitable, immediate consequence is an encouragement of private education, and that's because there's government policies that are denying those funds to the public school.
Okay. The next thing I'd like you to go into a bit, which I also saw as one of the important and original aspects of this, your argument, was you argue that the existing literature on welfare, the development of welfare systems, tends to overemphasize what is called path dependence. in discussing the limits and possibilities of welfare reform. And you argue that that much of the literature sees path dependence as some sort of independent determinant of change in social welfare. And you argue instead, and I'm quoting, that the path dependence should be seen as, quote, the playing fields where the disputes over social policy is played out. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, I think what I'm talking about there is this concept of policy legacies that is very common in the welfare literature, which is the idea that once a policy is in place, it has certain path dependence. What I was discussing just now about unions in Argentina managing the welfare, the health insurance funds, or the way Social Security is set up here in the U.S. Once in place, Social Security, no politician is one of those third rail kind of policies. No politician is going to dare take it away because it's going to be unpopular. Every social policy creates a constituency, and depending on how popular that policy is, the constituency is going to defend more tooth and nail those benefits, or actually no, they're going to let it die if it's deeply unpopular. I'm not denying the importance of policy legacies or the existence of path dependence, but what I'm trying to do is to bring the focus back to the dispute, the tension, the struggle between classes, and the creative potential, or the potential to transform society within those rails, or rails is a bad term because it means you cannot go over it, but in that terrain, that's the battlefield. But what defines the outcome is the battle itself. And so in that sense, I'm trying to bring back class struggle from the power resources theory of literature in the welfare literature to the center of the question. And in fact, I think that policy legacies themselves can be seen as the crystallization of a specific balance of power between classes, and at a specific moment that later has this path dependency effect. For example, there's, in the case of Chile and the pensions reform, everyone knows here that there was a military coup in Chile in 1973, led by Pinochet, supported by the CIA, that ousted Salvador Allende and quickly privatized education, privatized healthcare, and privatized pensions. The pension reform, the private pension funds that began in 1981, by 2000, the period I'm analyzing, 2006, there was a reform. They had become huge. They had become so powerful. I think the funds that they managed was around like 50% of Chile's GDP. And I don't remember exactly, but more or less. So it was huge. So they had a lot of power, lobby power, and capitalist structural power. If elected officials thought that any policy was going to cause disinvestment from those actors, they were not going to do it, even if there was no lobby, even if there was no direct communication. And so that's an example of policy legacy. Now, I think that's the terrain, but there's still the fight to put up. And this is exactly the clash between classes is something that is absent in most of the literature, particularly in social policy in Latin America. To give you an example, also from Chile, there's two authors that, when analyzing the reforms in the early 2000s, they mention the weakness of labor and the low density of unions as a policy legacy, right? Like turning it upside down, in my view, right? It's what I'm saying is, well, there's the main determinants of social policy is class struggle and the balance of power between these classes. And the terrain where that fight is being fought is the policy legacy.
Okay. And then finally, I wanted you to draw out what seems to be your political and strategic conclusions, which, full disclosure, was somewhat a contentious issue at your defense. Specifically, you argue that there's a fundamental tension between, quote, movements and political endeavors for emancipation and the strategy of taking control of the capitalist state to bring about this change. Would you expand on this and explain what you mean?
Yeah, I'm a socialist. I confess. So I believe that full emancipation, won't happen under capitalism, and there's obviously millions of people that think the same way. And for example, in the 2001 mass uprising in Argentina, there were mass movements that rose up, social movements, unions. Everything was up for discussion. There were local popular assemblies that mushroomed across the country in all main cities, and they questioned everything. And when the Kirchner came to power, part of the pink tide, the center-left governments, most of those social movements and political organizations that were on the left of the spectrum supported, endorsed, joined that coalition in power. And while as they joined, they incorporated the restrictions, the limits of this mindset of, okay, well, for the economy to keep afloat, to keep growing, to bring it back on its feet, we need growth, we need investment, so we can give these concessions, but we cannot give everything to everyone. And this is an exaggeration, but what I mean is that if we want to really think what's the best way to organize society in a way that we actually achieve emancipation, the end of oppression, the end of exploitation, well, those blinders that elected officials, that state managers have in terms of, this is the contours, this is the limit of what we can do in terms of passing reforms. We can't have them. We won't reach those conclusions. Unfortunately, most of the left in Argentina, say some notable exceptions like the Left and Workers' Front, most of them joined the Kirchners. And the problem was that after the Kirchners, and because their policy reforms were progressive, but they were not universalist, and because they enforced this division, for example, social assistance, something that we didn't talk about yet, but much of the expansion of rights and services and transfer was through social assistance. That means targeted to the poor. That creates clearly a division between those who are poor, those who are not, and it comes with stigma, and it comes with resentment from former working class people who are like, oh, they're getting it for free, and so all those things end up after many years, when there's not so much economic growth and there's not much money to fund these policies, it ends up creating a disillusion in social rights, in this rhetoric of the state as present, as guaranteeing your rights, that, among other things, fueled the rise of the far right in Argentina, Javier Milei. And so many of those people who voted for Milei, they were like, well, the idea of the inclusionary state doesn't mean anything to me, because I go to the school and it's falling apart. I go to the hospital and I have to wait 8 hours. So what does it mean to me? So I'm gonna vote for this guy who's saying you're gonna get what you do, and the most you invest in yourself, that's how you're gonna get out of this, and no more handouts for slackers and so on. That speech, that rhetoric, hits and has traction because of the disillusion in the previous previous political project, and the absence of a critical voice from all those organizations that before that were organizing the discontent.
Great. Thank you very much, Juan. That was really excellent. Great beginning. Why don't we start taking questions? I'll take 2 or 3 at a time, then we'll throw it back to Juan. Don't be shy. Pete, in the back. I do recognize a few of you, so I will call you by name.
Hey everybody. Hi, Juan. I'm really looking forward to reading this book, and it's great to see it out in the world. Just one question is kind of a lame methodological question, but I'd be curious to hear your answer, because I know that you have sort of come up with a very sophisticated way to measure commodification, decommodification of labor. And you at several points also mentioned economic growth. So I'm just kind of curious about the measure that you used for that. I'm assuming GDP, but I'd be interested to hear sort of how you conceptualize that, given that there are many critiques of GDP that it doesn't measure or poorly measures a lot of decommodified social reproduction and state service work. So at some point, if you can sort of wax poetic on that.
Okay. Let's get a couple more questions, comments.
Yes.
Yes, Jeff.
It's very, really interesting. You didn't say too much about income inequality, and I just wanted, or at least not just a moment, just to raise that issue here. You mentioned when the public sphere is very diminished, the private sphere flourishes, say schooling. But of course the causality goes the other way. That, you know, in countries with huge amounts of inequality, especially at the top, the well-to-do withdraw from the public services. New York City is a perfect example. Withdraw from public schools, public transport. So the inequality itself is creating the big private alternative, which is crushing the public grid. I must say, I've looked at this with public schooling. In New York City, there are high-income neighborhoods where 90% of the kids are in private school. The public schools virtually vanish, you know, and we know this, the incentives for investment. So inequality in the 90s in Latin America was famously falling. That's no longer true. So at the sort of macro level, how is the inequality pressing down on the public sphere that you're measuring so carefully?
Do you want to try these two first, and because they seem pretty meaty?
Yeah. So to measure decommodification, I assess more than 20 different indicators from the World Bank, from many different sources on 3 policy areas: on education, healthcare, and transfers. And within transfers, I divide between contributory transfers, which is basically retirement pensions, and non-contributory, which is mostly conditional cash transfers, but also non-contributory pensions too. And for each of those areas, I have at least 3 variables, one for each of the dimensions that I mentioned earlier: inclusion, generosity, and equity. And to give you an example, for healthcare, for inclusion, I use a measure from the WHO, which measures to what extent the population can access essential services, a set of 16 essential services. So that's a measure of access, of inclusion. Generosity is tricky with healthcare because it's difficult to measure the quality of healthcare. I use a proxy which is not perfect, but it's the best I could get, which is a combination of 2 different public spending variables, spending on healthcare, which indirectly measure the quality of public hospitals. And for equity, I measure the out-of-pocket cost and private spending on healthcare as a proxy for that division of dualism, or that let's call it this dual division between the private medicine that is only accessed by people who can afford it and is ostensibly of better quality, and public healthcare, public hospitals. The other question was the second. You asked that one, and about GDP. I used GDP per capita, and yes, absolutely, it doesn't consider non-commodified goods. But the reason why I measure it this way, and for me it wasn't so much of a problem, is because what I was trying to assess is one of the main constraints for governments to implement social policies is the revenue, how much revenue they have. And in order to assess the fiscal capacity to expand social policy, which was the main relationship that I wanted to assess, then you need a measure of GDP and just what's on the books, and that is a measure of how much revenue, tax revenue, the country is going to have. And there is a clear relationship between the growth in terms of just commodified goods, GDP, and expansion of social policy. And yes, absolutely. No, that's a really good observation, Janet, about it's not only the poor quality of public schools, for example, that pushes people to private, but also if there's more inequalities and there's more and more people that are wealthy and can afford it. The interesting thing about most Latin American countries is that in the 90s there was big economic growth, but inequalities persisted. And it's in the 2000s and early 2010s that inequalities fall. And so if we think about the effect, it would be the opposite.
Should be.
Right? Yeah. So, but if not, maybe it doesn't work the other way around, but in any case, it wouldn't be a confounding factor to explain the growth of private education, because there wasn't actually an increase in income inequalities.
But it was high anyway. Maybe it was already
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, but that's an interesting, and to be honest, I don't grapple much with income inequalities themselves. The book is mostly or focused on welfare policies and social rights and services.
Next book.
Next one, maybe.
Sorry, I don't know your name. Go ahead.
Jelena Žarković. I'm from University of Belgrade, Serbia. I'm just here. I saw your when I saw your invitation for this lecture. So my first thought was like, why there is no universal welfare state in Latin America? My first thought was like, there is a huge informal economy, and I don't know how much attention you pay for regarding that fact. I mean, I know that it's like a structural characteristics, and I just checked for Argentina, it's like more than 50% of those in informal employment. So why am I mentioning that? Because I recently found an article that addresses, like, reminding us what was the concept of welfare state for William Beveridge, and even for him, like, welfare was not about benefits for the poor, but for him, like, the main beneficiaries were, in fact, those in employment, middle class, employers, corporations. So if that is largely missing from Argentina or other Latin American states, I mean, how can you talk about real welfare state? That's what bothers me.
Yeah. Let's get another question to Keith.
Hi. I'm a history PhD candidate here, and I'm interested in thinking about the state and capitalism, and so I'm looking forward to reading your book. One related to that is this question, and I don't know how much you get into this in your book. I haven't really looked in detail yet what's in there, but I mean, are you looking at the way that welfare is used in these different economies, not only on a national scale, but on a global scale, like in terms of thinking about a global hierarchy and division of labor, and to the extent that certain universal or welfare regimes in the advanced capitalist countries have been used as a way to produce a more highly skilled working class, or a working class that's more engaged in intellectual, professional, banking, finance, etc. To what extent does that characterize the types of welfare regimes that exist in countries that are in a lower position in this hierarchy, in terms of the types of industries and economies that this country is, doing? To what extent is that impact what the ruling class of this country is trying to use its welfare regime, to reproduce the working class with certain skills or, lack thereof.
Good questions, and they're related in a way that they put it in a regional perspective or a global perspective. So I think it's the question about informality. Yeah, that's a key problem that all Latin American economies have, especially because there are like three traditions or three main types of social policy. One is like welfare benefits or services as a right. The other one is linked to your job or occupation, and the other one would be the social assistance or targeted, right? Means tested programs. The one that was most established and most developed in Latin America was the one linked to your occupation, to your job, which is called Bismarckian or conservative corporatist kind of welfare regime. There are many countries that have very little welfare development, and it's not even, many people argue that you shouldn't even, as you said, shouldn't even call it a welfare state. That's why people call it social policy more as a general term. But there are some countries that have really well developed. Uruguay, Costa Rica, Argentina, Chile, they have comparable to some high income countries. The problem with the benefits, health benefits, pension benefits mostly linked to your occupation is that it doesn't apply to the informal economy. Each trade, and there's another problem, which is that there's a lot of stratification across, even within the formal labor market, because if you're an architect, you get plugged in a pension plan that's much better than if you're a public employee, which in turn is much better than if you're a construction worker, for example. And each there are different layers of benefits, and so there is a certain level of solidarity because everyone pools their resources or contributions into the same fund, but it's only within that layer of the working class. So the solidarity is quite limited. So it's not the most decommodifying kind of welfare regime. No, the most decommodifying is when you have the pensions and high quality generous pensions as a right for everyone. And that in some European countries that have this corporatist kind of welfare regime, like Germany, there's the formality is really high, so they don't have this problem. There's really high inclusion, but that's not the case in Latin America, and that's one of the biggest problems in Latin America. That's in some countries half the population is straight up out of those policy regimes and plans. With regards to how, in terms of economic policy of the countries in Latin America, as most of the middle income countries, some low income countries, and I think that's a key reason why state elected officials decide to invest in social assistance programs instead of, for example, giving these benefits, access to healthcare as a social right, or enforcing labor laws so that everyone is formal. That would be another option, right? But if you do that, then you're gonna deter investment from some companies that are maybe don't have like such high profit margins, and so they need informal labor to stay afloat. And so there is a way in which, and I argue at the end of the book, that as long as exporter-oriented policies is the lay of the land in Latin America, then there's going to be a low ceiling in how much you can really expand, how much you can really provide and guarantee all these benefits as a right before you start undercutting the profit motive, the business climate, and the fostering of capital, of investment from domestic, but mostly from foreign capital, which is what most countries are looking for in Latin America. I do want to say that there's a measure that has been proposed in the literature to measure this, to test this theory, which is it's trade openness, which is imports plus exports over GDP, which is a measure of how open the economy is, how if there's too many barriers or low barriers to invest, trade, etc. And if we think that globalization, not open borders, but open trade and all that is undermining welfare, then we should see a relationship. And when I tested in the regression, when I tested crisis of legitimacy and economic growth and all those, it didn't show any relationship. So I couldn't really quantify that, and I couldn't really. So it's more of from the theoretical perspective, conceptual perspective. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. So it's kind of common, not like question, more like I want to share some the welfare system in China. Kind of similar, like because China's welfare, the pension system actually is tied in the employment. So which means if you don't have employment, if you're informal worker, you don't have pension. So the problem right now in China's situation, which also a question I want to ask in the situation in Argentina and other countries, like because the pension system actually was receive funding from the fourth generation migrant workers. So all migrant workers, like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they invest part of the fund, and right now they retire, so they're getting fund from that. However, because the decreasing of the birth rate, so we don't have much population right now, and which means for future generation, they don't see any potential potential like earning from the pension in the future. So because the whole pension fund actually was not enough they only able to support the formal SOE workers, stay-on enterprise workers, and also fourth generation migrant workers. And it's not enough to support the new generation migrant workers. And so first of all, and then the young generation migrant workers, or the young generation workers, they're now reluctant to pay the pension fund anymore. And the government actually forced them, because by law you're mandatory to pay the social security. And I think last year the government tried to enforce the law, and actually both the workers and the company, they're kind of reluctant to do that, because it's for company, of course, is a very high percentage of tax, like nearly like 20% of the salary, of worker's salary, and the worker nearly like 10% of their salary. And the worker realized, because the increasing of retired age, which means they're going to pay more, like normally we pay like 15 years of social security, and then you're able to receive pension fund after 60 years old. Now it's increasing the retired age, and also which means the pool, the pension age, the pool is also being narrow, and is in part basically for young generation. Even then in the formal industry, they're reluctant to pay the social security anymore. So no need to mention the informal industry, like food delivery workers. Of course they don't have protection, and of course you will ask them whether you want to be sign a contract with the food delivery company. They also don't want, because they know they need to pay like a 12 to 10 to 12, 15% of their salary to the company. So I'm not sure, the situation in Latin America, of course, the whole pension system, and in China actually is broke up, and the government wants to fix that. And Chinese government have money, but of course they don't want to invest the pension fund. Most of the money actually go to Belt and Road Initiative to invest other countries, to bring Chinese company to invest, invest overseas in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. But they don't invest the people's welfare, of course. So of course I know in Latin America, the country didn't have much financial capacity, but I'm not sure how the young generation react to if the pension system, the welfare system is broken. Did they really want to be in the formal system, and did they resist it? How they protest? I don't know. How they react to the system, or the broken system? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have two questions. First is a small question. Maybe I missed some information, but I think you mentioned an example that talking about that the government funds a lot in education, but it ends up that the public school is poor, the service they provide is poor, and then it lead a lot of people go to the private school. So I want to learn more why, even though government have a lot of funding, but the service of the public school is not good enough? And what is the structure? What is the structure reason behind this phenomenon? What do you think about this? And then I want to, is that possible you explain more in the political economy structure, that how such kind of failed policy, they strengthen the division of the inequality? I mean, how it related to the global economy, for example, global capitalism, especially, is that it related to the role of the Latin American in such kind of global economy? I'm not sure, but yeah, I want to understand more why the structure is that they strengthen more the division of the inequality. And I think the second question is that you mentioned that a lot of left party, they, when they get power, and then they use such kind of welfare state. They want to reform the system. So I'm curious that how welfare state idea as a system became a very popular approach, that when we think about welfare state, we always think that it is a possible way to do such kind of reform to rather than compare with the leftists, for example, in 1960s or in 1950s, maybe they would have other kind of approach, for example, revolutionize or do some land reform or something like that. But it seems that welfare state is a idea that very popular in the state that you are doing research in Latin America. So I just curious that how it developed in Latin American. Yeah.
How it developed.
Yeah, how it became a very popular idea for the left to try to change the society in this way.
Yeah, so the first question is an interesting question, because there was an increase in spending on education, and there was nevertheless an increase in enrollment in private education. So, and I think partly it is because the 2002 to 2003, when we begin to see these increases in social spending, they come after 10, 15 years of cuts to spending. And so there was, the truck of neoliberalism ran over many of these countries and left them with really like minimal functional budgets. And an increase in 1%, 2%, 3% is good and is welcome, but it may not make it a high quality kind of education. I think at least that's how I interpret it. The other reason is that when there's high economic growth in the country, there's also higher expectations. And so people are seeing that businesses are growing, that companies are making a ton of money, that that there's money to invest, and so the expectations and the demands for that also grow. And so something that might be enough 5 years ago, then after in Argentina they used to call it Chinese style growth, as in comparison to the level of increase in the GDP per year in China, which never reached that point really, but it was really high. We're talking about 5-6% a year. So if of that pie only a sliver is put aside for education, then it begins, it creates discontent, and it's gonna still create, even if there's an absolute increase in investment, it's gonna create desertion to the private sector. there's also the possibility, and I think this is a comment that I got, is that because economic growth also meant that more families had a larger income, and so more families were able to afford private education, and so that's another variable that is plugged in and might alter the equation. And with regards to the popularity of the welfare state, yeah, I think it's a very in some countries, not in all of countries, but in some countries there's a sense of entitlement. Argentina and Uruguay has a long history of public schools, public hospitals, and there is a demand for those to be high quality. But again, when many years go by with those public services offered in a half-hearted way, with low budget and with low quality, then that trust and that demand for public services really gets undermined, and then there's more of a push towards just privatizing everything and let the market decide, which is what, in a way, lifted the popularity of Javier Milei and the far right and libertarian government that's today in office. There's a very interesting concept that political scientists in Argentina coined, which is the idea of the mimic of the state, which is there was this rhetoric that the state was there for you, was present in the hospitals, in the education, but it was not real. It was only a mimic. It was a pretense. It was and so when people realized that was an empty shell, that wasn't really substantial benefits, rights, etc. Well, that's what people. That's what caused the fall of the center-left government and the rise of the far right.
It's very interesting because China, it seems, present a little bit opposite example to the case you are talking about, the Latin American, because China, they restrict such kind of privatization, the chain of the privatization, and then the state would have a lot of restriction for people for this trend of privatization, but it will lead to the people to anti such kind of state control.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. If I don't know much about China, I read stuff but if there's a parallel that in my mind kind of matches, is the idea of the Communist Party in China saying this is communism and changing the real meaning of communism, right? In that sense, it does sound like an empty shell, similar to what progressive center-left governments were saying in Argentina, in Uruguay, like this is the state for you, and actually, well, there's a lot of market here because no.
And yes, okay, you, yeah, okay, great, great.
I feel a lot of urgency in this conversation. I think about when there's reform versus like a reconstruction. As you said with Malay, it creates openness for authoritarianism. And when I think of these kind of promises of packaging, whether it's affordable housing or education for all or Obamacare, and then we see sort of the slap back of when that doesn't pan out. Same thing with like the NHS and like the vacuum for the Tories to come in and dismantle. I think of universalism here in the US, and it applies to services that protect capital. So if you are police force, if you are in the military, if you are a corporatist, you are then given actual welfare programs. Outside of those institutions, it's very difficult. And so when you are doing this work and you're relating it to sort of the urgency of a true sort of reconstruction through class struggle, like what is, like, yeah, what is some of the analysis there, and maybe the urgency of today?
Well, thank you. I guess my question is a very political one. I guess what would you? I'm sorry. I guess what would you say is the political appetite in even a handful of like Latin American countries for the equitable universalism you mentioned? Just, even over here, the Overton window was such an economics for a long time, and it's shifting, however slowly. Even the UK is a very conservative centric country. I guess do you see similar political disruptions where there's an increased appetite for the policies you're mentioning, and is it majorly different from the US and the UK in some ways?
Thanks so much, Juan. I had a question about, you mentioned the public and the private, but also sort of these other institutions that had been around for a few decades, but seem to have a greater presence, like religious institutions, evangelicals, NGOs, nonprofits, other institutions that are sort of entering the role of social reproduction. So schools, private clinics, or free clinics. So what role do they have? And then also with sort of the gutting of public infrastructure, this also migration of healthcare workers to the global north, and the crisis that's posing especially since COVID-19, since 2020, the worsening debt crisis in Latin America and globally. So apart from the public and private, how do you see the role of these other institutions, and then as sort of absorbing the sort of crisis, and then the role of sort of the gutting of public infrastructure and migration of healthcare workers out?
Yeah. So I'm gonna start with that one because I have my mind on this, so I'll go backwards. It's easier. I was thinking when you were talking about, for example, nonprofit. There's this idea in welfare literature about the welfare mix, which is the institutions that provide welfare to the population. And so there's this kind of three concentric circles. One is the state, the other one is the market, the other one is the family. I think the family can be family and community. And so if the state is providing universal benefits to everyone, then it's covered, right? When the state doesn't step in, then people solve it either through the market, if you have the means, or you get it in the family, you keep it in the family, right? And when we say the family, it's usually women, right? Women are doing the most of the care work, reproductive work. If someone is sick, if someone is old, if there are kids, who's taking care of them, right? That's what this means. I think many community organizations play that role in the sense of stepping in when the state is not there, and for families that cannot afford to get it in the market. There are non-profits and non-profits too, because, for example, in Uruguay, the main private actor providing healthcare to formal workers and whoever wants to buy health insurance, private health insurance, are non-profits. They are non-profits that are owned mostly by physicians, by the physicians associations, and they have really narrow sectional interest, right? It's not always all that progressive, right? So yeah. Then the other two questions were about the urgency of the political moment, and I think I'm gonna collapse them, because I think it's when you're asking about the appetite for universalist policies. Well, I think one example is pretty striking about that, which I talk about briefly in the book toward the end, which is the 2019 uprising in Chile. Of the three cases that I analyze here, Chile is the one where the balance of class forces was most in favor of the capitalist class, of the bourgeoisie, and also there was no crisis of legitimacy at the beginning of the center-left government. So essentially, there was no pressure, there was no interest in passing reforms that could be a concession to the working class, a big concession, like it happened in the case of pensions in Argentina or in the case of healthcare in Uruguay. And so that meant the pension reform and the healthcare reform in Chile under left governments, under Lagos and Bachelet, were shaped through and through by corporate actors. There's evidence, there's empirical evidence everywhere about how it was shaped by them. It mostly benefited them, and it made sure any provision that would undercut their profits was left out in the final bill. And so, what that generated was a disillusion, but also unrest. And the main when 2019 came and this explosion of social unrest happened in Chile, the main three demands in those mass mobilizations was public education, abolish private pensions, and equality in healthcare. So the three main policy reforms that are crucial or central in any welfare system. So I think the appetite is there. Now, I think part of understanding or part of the conceptualization of the balance of classes, balance of power between classes is not just, union density, whether there's a party or not. I mean, it matters the political articulation, the political, how that those needs, those demands from working class people are really shaped and congealed into a program that can energize people. I mean, we know the example of Mamdani here, right? in his way, running on a bourgeois party ballot line, the Democratic Party, we know it's not a socialist party, but it in its program, it expressed a lot of demands that were deeply felt by working class people in New York. And it won by a landslide, right? And it took that articulation of those rights, which are universal rights in some way, right? Free buses or free childcare for everyone in New York City. So the appetite is there. Sometimes there is no consistent party political project that can propose it, that can really run a campaign that will be willing to. In Argentina, what I was explaining, the most of the left was wiped out by the center left, right? And there was this restriction of the program. The developments, I want to say also that developments in New York are really great, but because it did express this working class need and power and force. At the same time, with this, we also see all the limits of trying, as I say in the book, to manage the capitalist state to deliver those. We've seen how it already, Mamdani has backtracked in many promises that he had made. So I think that's the risk of harnessing working class power, social movements, organizations that are potentially, not necessarily now, they're not necessarily in the program revolutionary, but they have horizons that may go beyond the limits of managing the state. Well, when you restrict them to what's possible within the limits of, okay, we don't want all business people to go away from New York and take away their taxes and all that, and so we're gonna temper a little down that's the risk that I see of on the project of trying to achieve those reforms basically through elections and managing the capitalist state as it is.
Camera in the back, yes.
Yeah, so I had a question about, the contents of the book, and that if you were to take an outside perspective, what would you say are some weaknesses in your arguments, and why do you see those weaknesses?
That's a tough question. I feel like I'm in a job interview.
Let's get some other questions out as well. Yeah.
Well, Along the lines of what you were asking about, in regards to the final section of your book, where you talk about the need for socialist transformation. It sounds like, if you could say more about the relationship between these legacy policies that you're talking about, like public policy, particularly legacy policies, and the power of the working class, because it seems to me like there is this this idea being put forward, like the working class wants to defend these legacy policies, and that a certain level of decommodification means more power for the working class. But we know that like a lot of policies limit the power of the working class. I mean, we can just even think of something like the New York state pension funds, which invest all of this money into corporations which exploit the working class, and whose job it is to weaken the power of the working class. But also even things like the National Labor Relations Act, right, which gave unions legitimacy and gave them a certain level of formality, but also undercut their power and limited like their ability to strike. And today, a lot of people will, working class people will vehemently defend like the National Labor Relations Act or something, as like a legacy policy, without sort of understanding the way that it built into those policies is already at the limits of the working class, things that are limiting the power of the working class.
Yeah, I'll respond to the weakness question first. I think one of the main weaknesses in my argument in the book, or at least in the way I measure decommodification, is that there's only one of all the 20 something that I measure inequities based on corporatist kind of welfare regimes, differentials in pension replacement rates according to what plan you have. And most of the my measure of the inequality or equality dimension is based on privatization and market policies, which is only one aspect of what I think it's an important weakness. At the same time, I didn't find many signs that those had changed, because those are law established rights and formulas to calculate pensions, and so they don't really change all that much over time as privatization, and particularly this privatization by default can happen. The question of social rights or policy legacies. Yeah, I was rereading some of the work, because once you publish, you're like, okay, I don't want to think about this anymore for a year.
At least.
Yeah, but I was rereading before this talk to have it fresh, and one of the things that I mentioned in the book, that I think policy legacies can be not policy legacies in particular, but more welfare rights, in the same way that the power resources theory conceptualizes them as a source of power. When you have that social right, you're more free to leave your job if you don't like it, go on strike, organize, etc. Well, I think you can liken those to, you can compare those to what Gramsci called trenches, in the sense that they are redoubts within a capitalist state where the working class organizes itself in an expression of solidarity, and that acquires certain rights that are expressed in workers' democracy. For example, within a union, we know unions are not perfect, many are not democratic, but there's the potential, right? And there's the potential of working class power within the capitalist state. This is what Gramsci called the integral state. And so, in those trenches play a I don't know, I would say a contradictory or a double role. In one sense, they expand the capacity of the working class to organize and to fight for their rights and to fight for social change. And on the other hand, they also foster conformism, and they can co-opt the working class. That's part of the so-called incorporation, right, of labor movements. Channeling within is like harnessing and channeling it through institutional mechanisms of conflict resolution, right? The NLRA that you were mentioning. Yeah, you have all this right. You have the right to unionize, but you cannot go on strike anytime. You know, there are things that you need to abide by, and so I think it works both ways. I think it has the potential, but it also encourages certain cooptation and conformism within the working class. That and it encourages it fosters the growth of also a layer within the working class and the labor movement that can be opposed to the rank and file, the labor leadership that can be, you know, where a labor leadership or labor officialdom or structure of bureaucracy that doesn't always have the same interest as the rank and file, to put it in a way.
Jacob, and then see who else.
Yeah, I had a question about the sort of level of analysis. So you're looking, I'm not sort of well read in the welfare literature, but in terms of like the sort of Marxist and Marxist variants on the questions of social reproduction, there's often in some ways, conflation of sort of daily, everyday reproduction. How do people sort of in the moment, every day, sort of meet their needs? And then this sort of generational question. The areas of education and health and sort of social transfers in terms of pensions, et cetera, sort of all fall in the realm of sort of longer term questions. But in terms of the patterns of commodification, the sort of way that you're looking at how the sort of privatization and funding, that relationship, but also like in terms of the questions about immediate struggle, you brought up Mondani. Almost all of his policies are about everyday life, how you get to work, the cost of food, right? How have you sort of conceptualized or measured those things within your analysis? And would that, I guess, about those two patterns, really, the one about commodification or decommodification, and then the sort of terrain of class struggle. How would that change, or have you sort of integrated in everyday social reproduction?
Other Sam?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you could talk more about how the political actors in these different countries, center left, and movements, unions, talk about, frame the demands around the welfare state. I really liked how you talked about the framing of different researchers and theorists. I was just curious if how people actually frame the demands and think about them strategically. And then I had a second quick question, which was, I know a lot of the debate I'm aware of, you talked a lot about the way in which these debates get framed around capitalist growth, but the thing I hear a lot about is the idea of like commodity prices and extractivism. Do those play a part in the debates about funding the welfare state in your cases?
Okay, difficult questions. No, what was your name?
Jacob.
Jacob. I don't really see as opposing the two spheres that you present as one long term. It absolutely, definitely, you're right on point that it's about social reproduction, right? And it at some point I was like, oh, I need to engage with social reproduction theory, and then I was like, oh, this is already too long, and it had too many legs, it was unwieldy. But it is exactly that. What I don't see is this dichotomy between longer term and everyday life. I do think that all those things that define decommodification, that whether you have unemployment benefits or paid sick leave or paid maternity leave, is an everyday issue, right? Of course, it's not whether you're gonna have money to eat or not, but transfers is that, right? For today I said poor people and unemployed, but that's not accurate in Argentina and in Latin America. Is for informal employed people and the poor, these transfers, these conditional cash transfers are vital for everyday needs, for affording to put food on the table. And that's, I measure that as, inclusion. My measure was the percentage of people under poverty, and of those, what percentage had access to conditional cash transfer. And then the generosity is how generous that transfer is, because there's transfers that are $10 and then there's some that are 200, and that makes a difference. Yeah, so maybe, I don't know if I misunderstood the question, but I don't see the opposition between those two. Do you want to say something, Dan?
I do, if I could just jump in. These are great questions. I think I'm maybe picking up on what you're saying. I'm sure we talked about this, but one of the critiques of the whole decommodification framework is, decommodification doesn't help you if you're not commodified in the first place. And so, after his book, the big book that introduces, came out in 1990, he kept feminists busy for 15 years. He created an entire industry of feminist analysis of decommodification. I think I got tenure on that myself. But anyway, the point of all that is that, it was especially focused on gender. And you're sort of talking about like the necessity of daily life versus the longer term. Huge numbers of people, less now than 40 years ago, a lot of women were never in the labor market. Decommodification is supposed to weaken your dependence on the labor market. So not only are a lot of women were not commodified, discouraged workers, in some sense marginalized informal workers, people pushed out at early retirement because, so decommodification, it's sort of it's a recovery and a protective mechanism, but within those limits. So that's something I think that needs to be factored in, that it takes various forms and it's not universally inclusive itself. I mean, you've sort of talked about this already, but we all know this, that it has a kind of an insider component. And so it can have an exclusionary, it can, anyway, that was a lot of what people were studying, was going back and looking at the Esping-Anderson framework, building in services focused on women and reproduction, and also outcomes more focused on gender. The typology came up with largely coherent, but not completely. Like the continental countries just split in half, with Belgium and France looking completely different from the German-speaking countries. And so I think that that's just something to remember, that it's a narrow framework working, as he started in Denmark, from the perspective of universal connection to the labor market, but that in itself was a fantasy.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. There are other ways in which Esping-Anderson's framework is absolutely incomplete. He's mainly talking about income replacement, and his measure is unemployment insurance. He doesn't measure healthcare at all. He doesn't measure education, access to education. And in that way, I think, more expansive
or childcare, I might add, or childcare, things that childcare, paid family
exactly.
leave, the things that enabled a lot of women, in fact, to enter the labor market, to have the privilege to become decommodified.
Exactly. That's why I decided to include healthcare. I decided to include early childhood education, which more than education is childcare, right? The younger they are, the more it is about childcare and less about education. But yeah, I agree with those comments. And
Sam.
Yes, Sam. No, I remember your name, but I forgot your question.
Sorry.
Oh,
How do political actors frame it?
Political actors. Oh yeah. It's interesting. Javier Milei, political actor, right? He talks about. He's the one who made popular the idea of the chainsaw to apply it to the state. He talks about the welfare state in those terms, of as handouts that should be cut off, and that we should let the market rule in every aspect of our lives. you have Kushnerist politicians who are more like, no, we need public healthcare, public education, accessible. But this is where the rhetoric that I was talking about today falls kind of empty or feels empty. There's one example that I think is interesting, which is the presidential debate in 2020 between Boric, who then became president, and Jose Cas, who lost the elections then but won now last year, in which they were debating about welfare policy, and he was like, Cas was saying something like, well, you oppose pension, you want to nationalize private pensions. And it was interesting to see how Boric, I identify with the same tradition of center-left governments that work within the limits of economics and mainstream, and economic growth, was backtracking from all that because he didn't want to scare investors. He didn't want to scare the companies, and he was like, well, no, wait, I'm open to, from promises that he had and his party and movement had done, and he was one of the main voices in the 2019 uprising, also very conciliatory, but and the same thing happened with targeted policies, means-tested policies, which clearly drive a wedge within the working class. And everyone knows, I mean, most people know in welfare literature, the targeted policies are the preferred policies of businesses because they targeted people that are already outside of the market, right? And so they are the ones that interfere the least with the market. And he had said he opposed it, but then he embraced it again. And so I think the rhetoric or the way welfare policies are framed in Latin America, they change a lot according to the political scenario and what's at stake. There's many examples of not just, I understand your question, not just about politicians, but also other actors. And there are many examples of unions that have fallen in different sides of policy reforms. And in Argentina, unions are traditionally much more, they're more powerful, but they're more conservative. And so they have opposed, rejected health reforms that could potentially equalize benefits. In Uruguay, the PCNT is much more left. It's linked to the Social Democratic Party there, and they have advocated for a universal healthcare reform, universal healthcare system, eliminating the private sector completely. But then when the Frente Amplio, this coalition of Labour Party and other parties took office in government, they were linked, had organic ties with the Labour Federation, they dropped that demand again. In a way accommodating to the new reality where they were part of the governing coalition, and so they needed to show certain, reasonability, to be reasonable in terms of how much you can actually change everything. I don't know if I responded, but that's just to give you a few examples.
Okay. We have time for probably one more round of questions. If anyone has anything that's been they particularly really want to raise or just are curious about, this is the time. Reminds me of some undergraduate classes I used to teach. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I think Juan will be around for a while if you want to continue the discussion informally. Thank you all. This is great. Anytime.